Alright, so since Zoom has a 5 minute limit, I am going to have to do a screen recording and a face recording, and we're going to edit them together. But this is my history presentation, and I'm going to be talking about the Reagan Revolution, and I'm going to be answering the question, to what extent was the Reagan Revolution a consequence of the American oil crises of the 1970s? And here we have a pin of Reagan's campaign, Let's Make America Great Again. He did it before Trump, so I found that very interesting as well. So we're basically going to be understanding the extent to which Reagan's economic policies were a consequence of the previous administration, to be able to answer our question of how he achieved the presidency using the OPEC oil crisis. And we're going to be analyzing three different factors. We're going to be analyzing the OPEC oil crisis, the change in public perception, the way people change their perspective of how government should intervene in people's lives, and how the economic domestic policy should function, and we're going to be talking about the decentralized economics, the platform of which Reagan was running, and the concept of Reaganomics. So first, we're going to cover the OPEC oil crisis to add context to Reagan's support. So this begins with the Arab oil embargo. The Arab oil embargo is a consequence of the Yom Kippur War. So, of course, Syria and Egypt launched an attack on Israel during the Arabi-Israeli conflict, and Israel effectively fights back. It takes Egyptian and Syrian territory, and they expect foreign powers to intervene and protect them. But Americans and other countries end up not intervening, and some even demonstrate support to Israel. And that was in October of 73. And so, in the same month, since the war was extremely short, OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, uh, created an embargo for Western countries such as the Netherlands and USA, and that embargo would expand, which quadrupled the price of oil. And the reason that OPEC is important is that they have 42% of the oil supply on Earth, and furthermore, at the time, of course, of in October 73. And beyond that, they also have around 70% of the oil. They have the oil storages on Earth, so they have a very significant power when it comes to controlling prices of oil, and they're effectively a cartel. And they're a cartel with countries such as a number of Middle Eastern ones. They also include countries like Venezuela, but of course, here they're representing the interests of these Middle Eastern countries, such as Egypt and Syria. And so, of course, this was a response to not only to the Yom Kippur War, so that maybe the U.S. and other countries would either intervene or they would be punished for the lack of intervention. But furthermore, it was also a response of Nixon's abandonment of the gold standard, because most oil was bought using dollars, and dollars ended up becoming a very important currency for dictating the price of oil. But Nixon in the 70s destabilized these prices by abandoning the gold standard and making it so the American dollars could easily change their value, and that heavily destabilized the oil prices. And so OPEC also did it in response to that. But eventually, they ended up going back on that embargo. But we have another very significant crisis when it comes to oil prices, and that happens in 78 and 79, right before uh, right before Jimmy Carter's and Ronald Reagan's elections. So here we have Iran performing its revolution. And so, in the midst of its very extreme political and social turmoil, they put down Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And that Shah was very sympathetic to the United States, and the new regime wasn't. Not only that, but it's very hard to export oil and to continue with your normal public government functions when we have a revolution going on, and there's a very important change in regime. And eventually, when that regime settles down, it's not sympathetic to the United States and other foreign and globalized efforts. And that causes one of the major one of the major supplies of oil in the world to stall their exports, bringing the supply down and making prices become very high. And here we have basically the price of oil here on the right. We see everything very steady until the OPEC oil crisis, and then we see it rise. And then here we have the Iranian Revolution, where it becomes extremely high. And it only starts to go down again in Ronald Reagan's term. And so a consequence of that is we can see a bit of consumer inflation here in the 1970s, where it starts to become very high as you go into the period of what's called stagflation here in the 70s as well. So it could be very affiliated with the price of oil going up, because of course, if the price of oil goes up, to produce items in things such as factories, to produce products, to produce services, a lot of people will need oil. Just look at, for example, the way that you would have a machine operator. For example, the way you'd have somebody drive a truck around to deliver goods, or a car to go to their job. Things became more expensive, and that's why we see stagflation, the inflation part of stagnation. And so technology had become reliant on oil, and so did Americans. American life was reliant on oil, so they faced not only an energy crisis because they could not fund their lifestyles in terms of energy, but they also faced an economic crisis because if the energy is expensive, so will every other product that relies on energy. And so consequently, they had to ration energy and they had to place speed limits. They had a 55-mile speed limit for cars because if they went much faster than that, they would end up consuming a lot more oil. And so and all of that is a consequence of oil prices surging. And we, in the end of the day, we also had a lot of panic buying as well. We see here as a lot of people had to stay in lines to get rationed amounts of oil, which is probably not going to be enough for their day to day, and that's really one of the main causes of stagflation, which is widely considered to have caused a recession and stagflation in the 1970s, or to have been a significant factor in causing stagflation. So, like we said, it increases costs of businesses for operating, and when businesses aren't at a profit, they must do things such as fire the people who work for them, and that causes mass unemployment, and that causes decreased supply as less people are buying from their products. Because with increased cost of living, Americans aren't going to have enough leftover money to consume other goods and services that aren't necessarily essential for their life. And of course, we talked about the 55 mile per limit 55 mile per hour speed limit as well, which was very annoying for Americans because if you're an American, if you're the average person living in a country, you're often gonna look at the impact that policy has on your life. And when you see presidents be affiliated, presidents like Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter be affiliated with you having to drive very slowly, everything you buy becoming very expensive, and you losing a job, you're gonna start losing respect for these presidents, even if maybe it's not a direct consequence of their policies. Even though you can make the argument that Richard Nixon's abandonment of the gold standard and Jimmy Carter's foreign policy could have caused this as well. So in 1979, right before the election, there were a lot of fears that there wouldn't be enough heating oil for the winter, and so people were scared. And right before the election, when Jimmy Carter was asking people to save on oil, to ration themselves on oil, he was offering a very depressive and very realistic view of what should happen. Ronald Reagan offered a very hopeful solution to the issue, and so people had a social reason to favor Ronald Reagan. And that takes us to Reaganomics. What is it? So basically, I would say that Reaganomics is a response to stagflation. Reagan ran a campaign promoting a series of economic ideas which offered a solution to the stagnation and to the oil crisis that had been taking place in the 70s, and that is what's called Reaganomics, a series of economic ideals. And these economic ideals are often divided into four, but we're going to talk about two of these main factors, which is the idea of supply side economics and decrease the power and the spending of government. And so the idea is that by decreasing federal taxes and government spending, you would have a lot of money back into the American economy and go to the working class, and so people could go back to consuming, back to buying and being employed and doing all these things that they were missing in the 70s. And the idea is that taxes on rich and regulation on businesses, if they were reduced, they would allow for these businesses to expand, to invest, and to, in the end, generate future jobs that could bring back the American economy. So it's the idea of supply side economics, where you're benefiting the part of economics of supply, because of course it's supply and demand, and that's a direct contrast with the demand side economics, or Keynesian economics, created by John Maynard Keynes, which is the idea that government has to take a very active role in the economy for stimulating certain parts of the economy and for generating demand. This was the opposite. They believed that to fix the economy of the United States of America, they had to step away and allow supply to do what it does best. And that's the idea of allowing businesses to operate more smoothly and consequently generate jobs and cheaper products for the American people. And another part of that was decreased government spending. If government decreased not only its spending, but also its regulations, it decreased how hard it was for businesses to operate. Not only it could achieve the first goal, but with decreased government spending, they could balance the budget, and they could also reduce inflation as well. But of course, this is something that didn't operate as was said by Reagan, because Reagan ended up massively increasing the military spending of the United States because of foreign policy, because of the intended victory on the Soviet Union. And so the budget wasn't balanced, but the supply side of economics was relatively successful, as for example, policy taxes on the rich were around 70%, and it ended up going very down. And it's based on the idea of the Laffer curve. So what the Laffer curve is, it's a it's a graph explaining the relationship between tax rates and tax revenue. So it explains that, of course, we're going to see a rise in tax revenue as tax rates go up. So as you ask for more money from the American people, you're going to get more money. But eventually, we have to start seeing a drop, because if you're asking for too much money from citizens, you are going to be encouraging them to not get jobs. For example, we know that if you ask for 100% of the tax returns, if you have 100% of the income of a person in your country, they will no longer work because they will not be making money. And so there has to be a point where it stops going up and it starts going down. And that's something that's very debated. So Reagan didn't think that that point was 70% as it was before. And a lot of economics agreed that it's closer to the smaller amounts than to the greater amounts. A lot of experts say 30%, but here this is a graph illustrating around that point as well. And so we also have to talk about voter perception. So economic policy isn't only about a president's approach to economics between him and his advisors, him and other politicians. Because of democracy, a president has to have his economic policy and any other domestic or foreign policy appeal to the people, and that's what happens. This economic policy offered hope. It offered a solution to stagflation, because previously Jimmy Carter wasn't offering a direct solution. He was instead asking people to ration, which, although it can be seen as something reasonable, it's something that if you're an American and your quality of life has dropped, and somebody's asking you to drop it even further, and that's your president, chances are you're not going to vote for him when the opponent offers a solution for it. That doesn't exactly require you to ration as much as you were before. And so, uh, stagnation, many experts would say that stagflation was solved by Reaganomics, as it would return money to the consumer, which would be able to use it to go back to their purchases. And so, inflation would furthermore be mitigated as governments would be spending less, and industries such as such as cell phones and TVs were deregulated. And so, with this deregulation, they could expand their businesses and operate more smoothly than before, which allowed businesses to thrive. And so, also Reagan offered, of course, countered this. We covered this with his military spending, which also increased the support for those dissatisfied with Mr. Carter's Dove approach, because Carter was seen as a person with very weak foreign policy. A lot of people blame him for the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranian hostage crisis, and so when Mr. Reagan would encourage military spending. He would offer a solution to foreign policy as well. But of course, this was very important when it came to economics, because this is good against the other policies that he was outlining, and this is something that one of his opponents would say. Some of the One of his opponents would fight against him during the Republican primaries and would effectively run as an independent. He would talk about how it's impossible. He would say it's impossible for us to both tackle this economic crisis while continuing to fight the USSR in the arms race. And so this is something that Reagan didn't directly tackle. He would say that he would do both. And when you are a voter, you're going to be encouraged by that thought. And so, with the winter of 1979 and 1980, in which the election was taking place, the fears of heating oil running out were high, as we talked about. And then, as we talked about, Carter said used this campaign to talk about rationing, about balanced consumption, while Reagan offered a hopeful economic solution. So Reagan campaigned saying that the government was difficulting the life of the citizens and that the citizens could easily bring themselves back up from their crisis if the government didn't intervene, rather than having them ration themselves. And this is the consequence of it. Mr. Reagan won with a landslide. Mr. Carter only won with 49 electoral votes, and Reagan won with 489 points. And we can see here, this is the first presidency, of course. And so we have to talk about other factors as well, because I think it would be very limiting to only see the impact that the oil crisis had on its victory, because his victory was also a consequence of other things. For example, the economic crisis, which really favored Ronald Reagan's campaign of providing an economic solution, wasn't only caused by the OPEC oil crisis and the Iranian Revolution oil crisis. It was caused by a number of other factors. And so, uh, experts like Milton Friedman, a very famous economist, would say that recessions are a consequence of bad monetary policy over international politics. And so many blame Richard Nixon for this. He had a Treasury Secretary that had no formal economic training and who many people point at having a very bad economic sense, as he would file for bankruptcy himself. And so the rapid rise of interest rates and an uneven budget left behind by Lyndon B. Johnson because of his Great Society policies and the Vietnam War would cause Nixon to try to abandon the gold standard to see the economy return. And he was and that would eventually frighten powers such as OPEC, which would eventually, of course, declare their initiative against the United States and other Western powers. And so, of course, a consequence of that, inflation rose. When you can print money freely and when you're facing stagflation, uh, you see inflation rise, and there was a fear of a recession, which pressured the central bank to reduce interest rates. It only furthered inflation, and it worked in the short term, but it led to the greatest inflation rate the United States has experienced, which is about 20%. And so he froze wages, resulting in food shortages. So the United States stagnation and stagflation was a consequence not only of the OPEC oil crisis, but the economic policies of Richard Nixon. Not only that, but as we talked about, the OPEC oil crisis might have difficulted Jimmy Carter's campaign, but it also is undeniable that his campaign wasn't as good as Mr. Reagan's. And so most voters, when they're voting on their presidents, they don't directly look at their economic policy and think about it for most of voters. They just go off their campaign. And so Carter's campaign was seen to be pessimistic, and Reagan's provided hope. Carter also missed the first presidential debate with Ronald Reagan and the centrist independent John Anderson, which is the Republican party from the man from the runner from the Republican primaries, which eventually ran as an independent. And so when he misses that, a lot of people will have their attention geared to these two people instead of Jimmy Carter, and a lot of people would maybe look at John Anderson as a more leftist approach to the issue when Jimmy Carter isn't there. And so in the final debate, he was many critics say that he lost his final debate, and Ronald Reagan, of course, is called the great communicator. So his loss wasn't completely unexpected for most people, as Ronald Reagan was very talented when it came to speeches, when it came to debates. And of course, there's a very significant situation in the Iranian hostage crisis. And so Carter was in the midst of the Iranian hostage crisis in the end of his campaign. And so American diplomats in the embassy of Iran were taken hostage by Iranian revolutionaries, and he was not able to solve this in his term. He tried to use economic pressure, but many people in the United States saw him as a bit weak. And so Reagan provided a strong, hawkish approach not seen in other presidents. He was strong in his foreign policy against powers such as Iran, and more importantly, to the USSR. And so this conflict would eventually be solved right in the beginning of the Reagan presidency, and most people would say that this was a consequence of Carter's policies, but of course, Mr. Reagan would be the one to get would be the one to get the reputation that comes with solving this crisis, of course, since it happened on his term. And so that was something that heavily impacted Jimmy Carter's campaign. And this leads us to a comparison. As I was looking at the voter map, I couldn't help but notice and then research that Jimmy Carter had the record for the greatest landslide against an incumbent president since Hoover. So it was the worst loss for a president seeking re-election since Herbert Hoover in the Great Depression, losing to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We can see here Franklin Roosevelt wins on Hoover to a very similar degree, but even to a bit less degree than Carter did. And these are very similar, and it's the idea that both of these presidents were heavily affiliated with the massive economic crisis. So when people looked at the 1970s economic crisis the United States was facing and stagflation, they would see the face of Jimmy Carter. And when they looked at the Iranian hostage crisis, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, they would think of Jimmy Carter. And when they were voting, they would see Jimmy Carter as the person responsible for this, and they would also see Ronald Reagan as the man who was providing hope. And at the same time, Herbert Hoover was being was when Franklin Roosevelt was running for president, he was trying to blame Herbert Hoover for the 1930s Great Depression. He was saying that he was the cause of the Great Depression in the United States, which wasn't exactly true, but it got people voting on his side. So when people looked at Hoover, they saw the Great Depression. When people looked at Carter, they saw stagflation. When people looked at these presidents, these incumbent presidents, they saw the economic crisis. They saw that their decreased quality of life caused by their presidencies, even if it wasn't caused by their presidencies. A lot of the economic situation, a lot of the economic crisis seen during Carter's administration were a consequence of Nixon's economic policy as well. And so, what can we affiliate the Reagan Revolution to? Because the question is, did OPEC did the OPEC oil crisis and the Iranian Revolution oil crisis cause? To what extent did it cause the Reagan Revolution? And so we can say that economically, right? One of the economic factors that led to the Reagan Revolution were a bad budget left behind by LBJ. We can say it's the bad monetary policy by Richard Nixon, and we could say it's the oil crisis during both Richard Nixon and the more important one during Jimmy Carter's campaign. So we have each one of these presidents provide an economic downturn for that eventually caused Reagan's economic policy to be well respected. And here we have the social reasons as well. Mr. Reagan was a very talented debater. He was very charismatic, and he was very down to earth, and he appealed to the common American. And he also offered a solution to issues such as the Iranian hostage crisis, which very much difficulted Jimmy Carter's attempt to become president again. And of course, you have the last factor, which is Mr. Reagan's economic policy. Reaganomics, which provided hope for many people. So we can say that the oil crisis proved a very significant factor in putting down the economy and consequently making Jimmy Carter seem like a bad president and helping Ronald Reagan win the presidency by having him provide a solution and hope and a new perspective on domestic policy for the American people as well. And so that's our conclusion. So the oil crisis provided a major factor in bringing down the economy, but there are other factors for bringing down the economy, such as Nixon's and LBJ's economic policies. There was also the very bad reputation given to Carter for after the Iranian hostage crisis, as well as, of course, the oil crisis seen before. And Reagan was used this dissatisfaction against the status quo, which was failing the American people, and appealed to working Americans. He was a great communicator, and he used that to make people side with him. And it worked, and it helped Republicans not only take the presidency, but take back the Senate after 26 years of Democrat majority. And that was the Reagan Revolution. So these are the causes of the Reagan Revolution. We can say that the OPEC oil crisis and the Iranian hostage crisis, no, sorry, the Iranian Revolution and the oil crisis that came as a consequence of that were very significant in helping Reagan achieve the presidency and helping Reagan have the Reagan Revolution, but it wasn't one of the main factors. It wasn't only one of the only factors. We can say it was a very important factor, but there were many other factors, and it